In the first part of this video, we pulled back the curtain on poor me's steadfast commitment to suffering, its inexplicable thirst to cling to pain and anguish rather than doing the vulnerable work required to find freedom. We explored how, for many, the decision to genuinely pursue solutions and commit wholeheartedly to change often can't happen until the pain of stagnation becomes utterly debilitating. Only when the anguish of more of the same exceeds the fears of diving into growth work does the soul finally surrender its grip on familiar suffering. If you've watched the first part of this video and you're still here, you may have already identified poor me's next self-sabotaging endeavor kicking in, making the therapist the problem and the target of anger. When poor me feels inadvertently confronted or threatened by the discomfort of the therapeutic process, it has a knee-jerk defense of lashing out by making the therapist the issue. A subtle shift in pronouns, "You're not explaining this right" instead of "I'm not understanding this," relocates all responsibility onto the therapist's perceived failings. This allows poor me to completely externalize and avoid taking ownership over its own struggles. "You're not giving me good enough tools to work with" becomes the battle cry, rather than a more vulnerable self-examination of the difficulties in utilizing the tools effectively. From this seedbed of deflected blame, poor me's hostility can escalate quickly. Poor me may get passive-aggressive, engaging in veiled hostility by forgetting appointments or completion of assignments, or it escalate into overt anger, criticizing the therapist's credentials, expertise, or even personality traits as a defensive rationalization. This externalizes poor me's difficulties as the therapist's fault, rather than an opportunity for the client's self-examination and skill building. At its core, making the therapist the issue arises from poor me's profound resistance to doing the brave inner work that leads to growth and change. The therapeutic process inherently brings up discomfort by challenging long-standing patterns and limiting beliefs. This sense of being confronted sparks poor me's reactivity. Rather than turning that spotlight of inquiry inward with vulnerability and self-compassion, poor me keeps its walls up by shooting the messenger. If the therapist is incompetent or not a good fit, then poor me conveniently gets let off the hook for its own feared difficulties and stuckness. In this deflection, poor me has twisted the therapeutic relationship from one of care and compassionate truth-telling into an ego-minded battle of who's right. The therapist takes the brunt of poor me's self-protective defensiveness, having been turned from a guide into an antagonist. To work through this counterproductive cycle, the therapeutic bond of trust and goodwill becomes paramount. The therapist must hold the space for poor me's inevitable reactivity with empathy and non-judgment, while also gently reorienting the work back to the client's responsibility to self. Reminding the client, "My role is to provide perspective and support, but this is ultimately your journey of growth." Setting clear boundaries around hostility or missed commitments, and most importantly, continually modeling the vulnerability and accountability poor me so desperately needs to develop within itself. For until poor me can tolerate having its self-perceptions lovingly but firmly confronted, it will remain trapped in an endless cycle of therapeutic sabotage through misplaced anger and blame. The way through that prison is the path of ownership, something no therapist can give, only something the client's truest self can choose. Other defenses: poor me's resistance, not following directives. A core technique therapists use is making directive suggestions. "This week I'd like you to practice this." But poor me has a habit of simply not following these directives without offering much reason. Homework never gets done. Recommendations for new behaviors go unheeded. And poor me downplays this passive resistance with dismissive, "Oh, I didn't get around to it. It's all been so hard, and why bother?" This allows poor me to stay stuck in familiar patterns without accountability. Poor me's avoidance, not doing homework, therapeutic homework, whether it's thought records, behavioral experiments, or reflective practices, is a critical part of making lasting changes. But poor me loves using excuses for not completing these assignments. "I didn't have time. I forgot. It didn't feel relevant." Whatever the rationale, putting off or skipping homework keeps poor me from doing the work required to reinforce new learnings, and start building new habits. Poor me's diversion, redirecting conversations. When a therapist tries to revisit or deepen an important therapeutic theme, poor me has a knack for redirection and derailing. It may gloss over the therapist's questions by changing the subject or introducing an unrelated issue. Or it may intellectualize and move into abstractions, preventing the conversation from touching deeper emotional soil. These diversions keep poor me feeling in control while dodging the vulnerability required for real self-exploration. Poor me's deflection, it's not that important. After initially bringing up an issue or pattern, poor me may quickly deflect by saying, "It's really not that big of a deal," or "I'm making too much of this, it doesn't matter anyway." This downplays the significance of the problem and avoids deeper exploration, preventing the therapy from effectively addressing the root causes. Poor me's dismissal, you're overanalyzing. When the therapist tries to look at something from a new perspective or make connections, poor me dismisses it as overanalyzing. Statements like, "You're reading too much into this," or "Now you're just overcomplicating things," shut down insight and meaningful self-reflection. Poor me's diversion, going on tangents. In the midst of discussing a difficult topic, poor me may go on unrelated tangents or get lost in excessive storytelling. This allows it to avoid sitting with discomfort or going to the emotional depth it fears. Poor me's defensiveness. It's just how I am. Rather than being open to change, poor me takes a defiant stance of, "This is just my personality," or "I've always been this way." It uses this as justification for resisting new perspectives or adaptations that the therapist suggests. Poor me's pessimism. Nothing will change. When a therapist tries to instill hope or possibility, poor me undercuts it with disheartened statements like, "I've tried before, it never works," or "People like me can't change." This resistant pessimism halts any therapeutic momentum. Poor me's vagueness, avoiding specifics. The more general and vague poor me can stay, the less it has to engage with the specifics a therapist needs to help. It may respond to questions with ambiguities like, "I don't know, things have just been hard," rather than describing precise feelings, situations, or behaviors. Poor me's forgetfulness, claiming amnesia. When a therapist tries to revisit an issue discussed before, poor me may feign forgetfulness or memory gaps to avoid any accountability or depth. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," or "I don't recall that coming up," can halt therapeutic progress. In all these cases, poor me utilizes various resistance tactics to subvert the collaborative work of therapy. It aims to maintain a self-protective distance from vulnerability, difficult emotions, or the potential for change. The therapeutic relationship requires a commitment poor me actively undermines. As we've seen laid bare in this video, poor me will insidiously go to great lengths to subvert therapeutic progress and true growth. From its inexplicable thirst to cling to suffering, to erecting flimsy excuses, to lashing out and making the therapist the enemy, these are just a few of its crafty, self-sabotaging deflection tactics. Make no mistake, I know very well that ripping off the band-aid to expose poor me's ploys has felt harsh at times. The words I used to describe its avoidant behavior have not been sugar-coated. That's because I'm coming from a place of sheer determination to help you crack this code once and for all. For too long, poor me has remained an amorphous, slippery fog, easy to blame yet difficult to clearly see and unhinge yourself from. But treating it with kid gloves or coddling its delusions allows the cycle to perpetuate ad infinitum. So yes, you've received a straight hard look at poor me's antics through an uncompromising lens. The ways it keeps you stuck and suffering have been spelled out in stark clarity, without minimizing or euphemizing the self-defeating patterns. This tough love approach comes from a mission to reframe your relationship to poor me entirely, to go beyond vague self-flagellation and take an honest, unsentimental inventory of the precise psychological acrobatics keeping you from wholeness. Because once you get grasp on poor me's subconscious tricks and can call them out for what they are, you remove its power over you. The ostrich-like stuckness begins giving way to lucid self-authorship. However, this sober reckoning with poor me's strongholds does not come from a place of harsh judgment or lack of compassion. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's tough love at its core, an unconditional belief in your capacity to face unvarnished truth as the first step towards freedom. You don't have to remain trapped in this cycle of self-defeating behavior. With radical awareness of poor me's endless shape-shifting and compassionate self-accountability to name its games, you can start disarming its self-protective maneuvers that keep you stuck. The path will still be arduous at times, but now you have schematics to poor me's madness. You can see its mechanics for what they are, fear-based coping personas that can be systematically unlearned. All it takes is an unshakable decision to live in truth over delusion. The path isn't easy, I know. Poor me's fear of vulnerability and discomfort is powerful. Its resign and defiance can feel like an impenetrable fortress at times. If you identified yourself as a poor me, know that you have the capability to systematically dismantle those stubborn walls. As a mentor, I've witnessed countless individuals like yourself who felt hopelessly mired in the familiar anguish poor me perpetuates. Yet every single one of them was able to activate their innate courage or are firmly on the path to take back their power, having made the wholehearted choice to engage in their growth in a new way. I'm here to assure you that mustering of humble commitment day after day is how the fortified walls start crumbling. It may feel glacially slow at first, but the old patterns do start to loosen their grip. You'll notice windows of freedom opening up, moments when poor me's voice doesn't hold sway. And in those spaces, you'll have the sacred opportunity to try new ways of being, follow through rather than self-sabotage. Each time you compassionately realign with your highest aspirations, poor me's control over your internal world weakens. Eventually, you'll be the one confidently holding the compass, trusting yourself to navigate any terrain. All any of us can do is show up, over and over, letting our fractured selves be slowly rebirthed in that commitment. So if you're ready to loosen poor me's shackles, I'm here to support you every courageous step of the way. The hardest step is simply making the decision to start, but I believe in your capacity to author the life you've been longing for. Let's walk this journey away from self-sabotage and into your highest potential together.